Hey there, and welcome back from the break. Hope everyone is feeling safe and healthy. As I've said online, I'm going to miss you all these coming weeks. This is not my favorite way of doing things. I very much prefer to see you in person. But as long as we all feel safe and healthy, that's what's really important in the world today. We're going to continue on. I'm going to finish talking about perceiving the auditory scene. We had really done quite a bit of this, and we're just finishing up talking about melody, and then at the very end of this chapter, he has one of those, it's called Something to Consider sections, where he talks about the interaction between visual information and auditory information. Some of this is background context. We had started talking about musical organization and melody, but I'm going to go back through that as a kind of context. I'm going to go through it rather quickly, and then we'll move on to musical organization and rhythm specifically. So he talks about music as organized sound, and that we are creating these melodies as we are listening to sequences of pitches where we experience them as belonging together in a meaningful way. We also talked about the smaller components of a melody, so these phrases that make up the melody, and what influences how these phrases are created. And then we talked about grouping and how we do this kind of auditory stream integration. So if you remember, as we talked about the auditory scene and how we separate things like the tuba from the piano from the singer, that is an auditory stream segregation, that we're segregating those components into their separate components. But we also have an auditory stream integration, which there is some overlap here in what we talked about as far as those principles of how we segregate things, because part of that is that we are integrating something like we're integrating notes into a melody, for example. And then what creates those melodies, or what causes us or helps us to have this kind of auditory stream integration. And we talked about proximity, which again is hearkening back to what we talked about for quite a while with the auditory stream segregation, that if notes are close together, we're going to put those together into their own melody. And then he also gives us this, when we do have these large pitch intervals, these large changes, we tend to go up and then we have this gap, and then we gap fill coming back down with smaller pitches. And he gives us the example of Somewhere Over the Rainbow, if you can imagine hearing that song. We also discussed tonality, and this idea of tonal hierarchy, that we want songs to begin on tonic and end on tonic. If I'm in the key of C, that means I will begin on C or a C chord, and I will end on C or a C chord. And there are tones that sound better to us. So if we had people rate these tones, and of course the tone of C in the key of C sounded the best. We rated that very high. And then came E and G, so what makes up the C major chord. And then came the next thing we liked the best was the other tones that are within the key, and the things that we liked the least were tones that were outside of the key. So we have this kind of tonal hierarchy in what we prefer. That came from the Krumhansel and Kessler of 1982, and then Carol Krumhansel also did a study in 1985 where she statistically analyzed the compositions by famous composers, and she found a 0.89 correlation with tonal hierarchy. This is a very high correlation with, so what we prefer to hear is what composers are using. And you can see to some extent this has the confound of, we like things that are familiar, and this is what we've likely heard, but it all works together very nicely to create this tonality that we find acceptable and that we prefer. Another way of talking about tonality is to consider it as a kind of musical syntax. So if you think about the syntax and structure of language that helps us to make sense of it, that music has its own kind of structure, right? So in 1997, Osterhout et al. Came out with a study where they were examining ERPs This is an EEG, so the EEG is getting the electrical activity at the scalp, and an ERP is the event-related potential, and this was specifically in response to a syntactic violation in language. So if you look at the figure over there, the cats won't eat. We see the blue, nice normal going waveform, and if they gave them a syntactic violation, the cats won't eating. So at the word eating, if we look at the waveform in response to that, we see a positive going component at 600 milliseconds. So this kind of that doesn't make sense about the structure. So in 1998, Patel et al. Came out with a study where they examined ERPs in response to syntactic violations in music. And again, this is something we did do in class, and I showed this very briefly. So from now on, you're going to have to go look at your figures in your book, because I usually bring the book and put it up on the overhead. But in this figure, you can see that if they had a chord where they stayed in key, we saw a nice normal going waveform. If the chord was in a different key, that was a close key or a near key, we saw a waveform where there was a P600. And if it was in an even more distant key, that P600 was even more pronounced. So we see a similar kind of response in the brain to these structural violations. Finally, we talked briefly about tonality as partly influencing our emotional response to music. And actually this has a bunch of different aspects of how music influences us emotionally. But I start out with the regularities in the environment, that kind of discussion again. There is a link here that I did not show in class, but it is provided in Blackboard for you if you want to go watch this Power of Classical Music, because Chopin was particularly good at manipulating our emotions by manipulating this kind of expectation of, says you're going to go back down to tonic because that's the expectation, and then but instead he kind of pulls you back away, goes back out of key, and dances around it, which really influences our emotions. But we talked about how many different ways emotions are influenced by listening to music. Okay, and so that is what was really repeated from what we did on the Wednesday before break. Now we're going to move on to musical organization and the aspect of rhythm. So really the melody, or a lot of the aspects of melody and those frequencies, are the manipulation of how music is organized by frequency, by pitch. But now we're going to look along what I was referring to before as kind of the x-axis, right, as we're going across horizontally along this. What he gives us here is the beginning of the Star-Spangled Banner. As we're moving along horizontally, music also is organized in time, and rhythm is the time pattern of the durations created by notes. So really it's the onset of the different notes, the onset time of the different notes. And so I'm going to do this, try to make this rhythm as I can. It goes eighth, eighth, quarter, 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 half, eighth, eighth, quarter, 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 half, eighth, eighth, like that. And he gives us the blue dots as a kind of, this is the rhythm of this song. He then talks about the beat as the pulse of music. So if we look over at our figure, at our treble clef there and our flats, we have a 3/4 time, which tells us about the beat or the pulse of music. And it's going to have a 1, 2, 3, as we have 3 beats per measure. And that's the kind of feel of the song. And so what we typically do is this 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And as you might know, this is the feeling and the meter of a waltz. And so when I do the beat, I almost have to do the meter. And so if you look down at the bottom, he, with the red arrows, is giving us the beat of this 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, trying to do it without the meter. And the meter is taking into account those red asterisks, that what we tend to do is a 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 in this kind of triple meter where the accent is on the first beat of the measure. Okay, we also have a duple meter when we go 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. In this kind of march, more of a march kind of feel than a waltz kind of feel. And again, this is all really the pulse of music. He mentions how when we are tapping our toe or moving our hand to music, we're probably doing this to the beat of music. I often feel like I'm moving to some extent to the rhythm of music, as we're going to see in the very next slide. Our basal ganglia are very active when we're listening to music, as we are, even when we're not moving ourselves, our brain is responding as if we are moving to some extent. So Braun and Rowe in 2009 found a connection between beat and the activity of the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia are these subcortical structures that are responding to our voluntary decision to make a movement. They often, what they'll do is they'll sort of take over a lot of the habitual kind of, this is what we typically sort of do. So when we're talking about activity in subcortical structures, this is usually activity that we're not aware of, right? So it's kind of this unconscious part of our processing. And what they found was that the basal ganglia and the connections between the basal ganglia and some of the cortical areas, so as we get up into the cerebral cortex, some of those cortical motor areas, those connections are more active when we're listening to a beat condition compared to where we're listening to a non-beat condition. And so a couple of things about what I'm saying about this figure. I went and looked this up because I thought, how did they make a non-beat condition? No matter what you do, you're going to have some kind of beat in there. We can't, it's really difficult for us to create a non-beat, but they truly did go in with a computer that randomized the non-beat so that there would not be a beat. The other thing I want to clarify here is that I looked up this picture because it was really odd to me that the basal ganglia are in the front of the head and the motor areas are in the back of the head, and that's not the way that looks. Okay, the basal ganglia are down. So this slice through the head that's kind of idealized here is actually a diagonal slice. Okay, the basal ganglia are down, they are subcortical areas, and those blue balls that are representing the motor areas, they're much farther forward than they look, because again, this is a diagonal slice. In another study by, I think it was Iverson and Patel, they had participants listen to what you can see in A is there would be sound bursts that would be short, long, short, long, short, long. This was counterbalanced so that sometimes they started out with long, long, short, long, short, long, short. And then they would have people listen to these and ask them what they perceived. One of the aspects of the rhythm of music that we notice is that if you look across cultures and across different musical styles, that the rhythm of the music, the patterning of the music, is very much influenced by the rhythm and patterning of the language. And so if we look at English speakers, our language tends to go short, long in its pattern. So the book, to eat, the dog, and so forth. If we look at Japanese speakers, their language goes in the opposite direction typically. So he gives us the example, I don't really speak Japanese, but he gives us the example honga. So honga is the book, where hon is book, and the modifier, the determiner there is ga, and so it comes after. So it has a long, short kind of patterning or rhythm. So they had people listen to these, and they were either English speakers or Japanese speakers. And if you can see in the figures in B that English speakers tended to perceive this as short, long, more so than Japanese. Japanese speakers were more likely than English speakers to perceive long, short. Usually here, I play a small amount of a Peter Gabriel CD that, so he had two compilations where he had a lot of people from all over the world help him with his music, and then he went and produced a compact disc back in the day, he went and produced a compilation of them playing their music. And I usually play something from the Middle East right now. I am going to look this up and provide a link on Blackboard if I can find something that works. Finally, in the Something to Consider section at the end, he discusses the interactions between vision and hearing. I'm actually going to talk about a slightly different study than the one he presents, but it's a similar kind of study, and you can see now 2 examples of how we see these interactions between vision and hearing, and they occur in both directions. And so I start out with this ventriloquism effect, and we're going to see this, we're about to do speech, and you'll see this in speech too, that we have a very strong kind of audio-visual kind of perception of speech, that our vision helps us a lot to understand when we are listening to someone talk, if we can see them. So one example is the ventriloquism effect, of how strongly vision affects our interpretation of sound, and especially the localization of sound. So we have this kind of visual capture. The ventriloquism effect is, if I am a ventriloquist and I have my dummy and I can keep my mouth still while I'm talking, and then I move the dummy's mouth, it sounds like, to people, it sounds like the sound is coming from the dummy's mouth. And we have this kind of visual capture. We've all experienced this in movie theaters as well. With movie theaters now, and you might even have a system at home where, if you can't appreciate that kind of how they're creating those sound localization cues, that it sounds like something's coming off from the left or from the right and behind you, that is really kind of cool. What's happening when the people are speaking on the screen, right? That information, that sound is still coming from the speakers. The people who are doing the speaking on the screen, they can be anywhere on the screen, and it sounds as if the words are coming, the sound is coming out of their mouths. And so that's kind of cool. So it has this really strong visual capture. So that's one influence of vision on our hearing and our perception of the auditory world. But we also see an effect of hearing and our auditory world on our interpretation of our visual worlds. And so this study comes from Secular et al. You can see, so what's happening in A and B in the visual world, the same exact thing is going to be happening on the screen. And in a no sound condition, what it appears like happens as these balls move on the screen is that the ball that's up at the left top corner moves down to the bottom right corner. The ball that's in the top right corner moves down to the bottom left corner. And they kind of just pass by each other. The only difference between A and B, again, the visual world is completely the same, is that in B, there's a click added right when those balls come together at the center. And so what people now perceive is that, I'm just going to do one side, where the ball at the right top corner, right, it comes down to the middle, it hits the left ball, and then goes back down to the bottom right. Okay, so the interactions between vision and hearing are very interesting. And this is the last slide of the PowerPoint. So again, welcome back, and we will do a little bit of speech today. I hope you all are feeling not only just safe and healthy, but not stressed about how everything is going to be changing quite a bit. I'm going to do my best to make this as easy as we possibly can, and as similar as we can to us actually being in class. So let me know if you have questions about material. You can email me, and as much as possible, I will answer questions at the beginning of the next PowerPoint for the next class. There will be times when I'll email you back, but I think not only so that it feels a little bit more like a class, but also so I'm not just emailing back and forth, that it would be nice to have a little bit of a question and answer section. And I know that sensation and perception has some complicated concepts in it, so do make sure that if you have questions, you are feeling comfortable about asking them, and not just about the material, but about the logistics as everything moves forward. All right.